Good morning, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the pulpit. We are founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. So the way our church works is that anyone who is a member is invited to come and give a talk on the topic of their choosing, as long as it's an atheist talk. So today we have Stephen, and he's going to be talking to us about a defense of evolutionary ethics.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start with a story. This is a story from the early 1970s, and has to do with Stanley Milgram. And we talked a little bit about Stanley Milgram already. He's the guy who did the obedience experiments. So he did a study where he wanted to look into morality, and he wanted to do something really simple. What he wanted to do was ask his students to get onto the New York City, subway, and just ask for people to give up their seats. Just to come up to a stranger and say, "Hey, may I have your seat?" and see what would happen. Now, what was surprising when he tried to do this study is he couldn't get his graduate students to do it. They just couldn't do it because it was so terrifying going up to a stranger and asking them to give up their seat on the subway that they refused to do it. All of them except for one. So one of the graduate students were able to do it. And so Stanley Milgram lost patience with his graduate students. And he said, "Okay, I'll just do this myself." So he got on the subway and he decided that he would try, asking people to get off their seats in the subway. This is his description of his experience doing this. "The words seemed lodged in my trachea and would simply not emerge. Retreating, I berated myself. What kind of craven coward are you? Finally, after several unsuccessful tries, I went up to a passenger and choked out the request, 'Excuse me, sir, may I have your seat?' A moment of stark anomic panic overcame me, but the man got right up and gave me the seat. A second blow was yet to come. Taking the man's seat, I was overwhelmed by the need to behave in a way that would justify my request. My head sank between my knees, and I could feel my face blanching. I was not role-playing. I actually felt as if I was going to perish." So this seems a little overly dramatic to me, but that was his experience, right? So he actually had a pure emotional reaction to breaking norms, to breaking standard subway norms about requesting seats, and it overcame him. So the topic of today's sermon is I want to talk about a theory of morality that's based off of emotions. And this is actually an extension to the last sermon I gave. I want to talk about Jesse Prinz's third book. He wrote a book called The Emotional Construction of Morals, where he tries to justify his particular take on morality by appealing to the theory of emotions that we talked about in the last sermon. So Jesse Prinz actually wrote 3 books, and the 3 books correspond to David Hume's 3 books on his treatise on human nature, and this is his 3rd book. And I want to talk about his theory. The reason I want to talk about his theory is I like large parts of it. They seem intuitive, they seem right, they seem backed by scientific evidence, but I don't like where it leads him to. And so, first part of this talk, I'm just going to talk about what his theory is, and then I'm going to object heavily to it at the end of the talk and complain about where his theory led him and suggest ways to get out of where he ended up going. So Jesse Prinz makes 2 claims. First, he argues that the foundation of human morality are the moral emotions. The second big claim he makes is that moral emotions are determined by culture and not biology. They're culturally determined instead of being biologically determined. So just to be clear, I like first claim, don't like the second claim for reasons I think will become obvious as we move on. But let's talk about, first I want to give a quick review of his theory of emotions, because everything else that Jesse Prinz talks about is dependent on his particular characterization of what human emotions are. So I'm just going to give a quick overview. So he defends something called the embodied appraisal theory of emotions, and that consists of 3 claims. The first claim is emotions are non-cognitive. They don't consist of judgments, they're just gut feelings, gut reactions to things. And in fact, one of the useful things that I think Prinz brings to the table is he says your actual emotional feeling is your perception of bodily changes. So when you feel fear, you're actually perceiving your heart racing faster, your hands getting, clammy, your hair standing on end. That's the sensation of fear. That's what you're experiencing when you're experiencing fear. And each of the different emotion types, there's a different pattern of bodily changes, and you're directly perceiving those changes. And that's the gut feeling of fear. And that's really the basis of what we mean by emotion, those gut reactions. Second claim he makes, our emotions can be justified or unjustified. They're truth act. They can be true or false. And what he means here is he means, you can have a justified fear of a rattlesnake. If a rattlesnake came in right now, makes sense. You should be afraid. Please be afraid. You're justified in feeling that fear. If a garden snake wandered in, that would be an unjustified fear. So emotions are the types of things that, like, normal propositions can be true or false. And that leads us to the third claim. What Jesse Prinz wants to argue is that emotions are representational. They're non-cognitive, but they're representational in the sense that each of the emotions were selected to signal a different human concern. So in particular, fear was selected through natural selection to have the function of representing danger. That's why we feel fear, because it represents danger. Anger represents offense. Sadness represents loss. Happiness represents achievement or attainment. So in the same way that a fire alarm has a function of being a signal for smoke, your emotions have the function of being a signal for different human concerns in the environment. So that's his overall theory. Yes?
What was the one for anger?
Oh yeah, offense. So offense. And we'll talk a lot more, we'll talk a lot, transgression. Yeah, no, that's right. And we'll talk more about anger in a moment because it plays an important role in his theory of the moral emotions. Yep. All right, so that's his basic theory of emotions. So he agrees with, with Pongsep and Ekman and all these guys that there's a basic set of emotions, 5 or 6. He's not, super fixed on what those basic set of emotions are, but he wants to say that things like anger, fear, sadness, and disgust, those are just innate emotions. Those are the basic emotions that everyone shares. But then he believes that humans can develop new emotions. And they can do that there's 2 ways of doing it. You can take some of these basic emotions and blend them together and create a new emotion. For example, if you blend together anger and disgust, you get contempt. That's where you get contempt from blending together anger and disgust. So you can get new emotions through blending. The other way that you can get new emotions is through a process he calls recalibration. And the idea there is there are the normal elicitors of an emotion, but you can also recalibrate the emotion so it's caused by a subset of the normal elicitors of that emotion. So he gives the example of pride. He wants to say pride is joy, but joy that's triggered by your own achievements instead of other people's achievements. So he wants to say, look, you can take these existing emotions and retarget them at different, with different causes. And we can make sense of that. Those are derived emotions and basic emotions. So that's pretty much it. That's his overall theory. That's as much as I'm going to spend summarizing it today. But it gives us enough to move on now to his moral theory. The main features, again, are emotions are non-cognitive on his theory, so that he can come up with a non-cognitive theory of morality. So let's move on to his moral theory. So what are the moral emotions? So he's basing his ideas here on the same sources that Jonathan Haidt talked about thank you, Brandon. Jonathan Haidt brought up before, where he's basing it on Richard Schwader's research. He's an anthropologist into the morality that different societies have. And so Schwader has, again, he's an anthropologist. He has this theory that there are 3 standard foundations of morality that you'll find in different societies. It's called the CAD model, C-A-D, and that's an acronym. And C stands for community, A stands for autonomy, and D stands for divinity. So different societies emphasize different types of emotions. So let's start with autonomy. That's the foundation that Western societies tend to emphasize. And the idea of autonomy is if you don't cause other people harm, then it's okay. If you cause people harm, then that's morally bad. So that's the foundation of autonomy. So stealing something. If you go off, steal some money from someone, that's obviously causing harm. That's morally wrong. So that's the foundation of autonomy. That's the main foundation that they argue that Western societies have. But there is other foundations. So Schwader did his research. He did his field studies in India. And he emphasizes the foundation of divinity. And the idea, this doesn't have to be religious divinity. It has to do with some sort of moral contamination. So it can be some sort of moral contamination. And it doesn't have to have anything to do with harm. So the idea is, here's some examples. Using the American flag to clean your bathroom. Doesn't harm anyone, but still it just seems wrong, right? Shouldn't use the American flag to clean your bathroom. That's a wrong thing. It's another example.
The American flag does.
Yeah, please don't do that at home. Polluting the environment. Again, that's pretty clearly, a contamination issue. If you care a lot about the environment, throwing trash in the environment, that's, again, you don't like that one.
That's harm. It's
well,
harm. It's tragedy of the commons harm, but it's still harm.
Maybe. Let's pretend that you're throwing it where, I don't know, where Smokey Bear is out there. We'll grab it really quickly and put it into a garbage receptacle. I don't know. But yes, we can argue about that. Last one, here's another example. Let's say that I have this nice sweater sitting next to me. And it's really warm, it's a cold day out, and I say, hey, do you want to wear this sweater? You say, sure. And you put the sweater on, and I say, oh, I didn't tell you, that was Hitler's sweater. You immediately feel repulsed. You say, wait, Hitler's sweater? You had me put on Hitler's sweater. That's that's moral contamination because somehow, I don't know, it spread to Hitler's sweater. So not really directly harm in that case. So anyway, that's the foundation of divinity. The third foundation is community. And the idea, that's the C in the CAD model. And community is disrespect or respect or being concerned about rank, right? So example of that is you sit down at your table, you have your grandparents are there, there's a teenager there, and the teenager starts eating before the elderly people do. That's a show of disrespect, and so that's bad. That's another, certain societies really, really care about hierarchy and rank. Not so much in Western societies, but we understand the idea. So I should be clear that neither Schwader nor Prinz are saying that, a society just has one of these and not the others. They're saying that they're emphasized to different degrees in different societies. Western societies, we care a lot about autonomy, maybe not so much about divinity and community in the same way. All right, so that's the context in which he wants to build his moral theory. Now, what Jesse Prinz wants to claim is that the moral emotions are the basic emotions recalibrated to these different norms that you have from the CAD model. So in particular, Jesse Prinz argues that moral anger is anger recalibrated to be caused by a violation of autonomy. So when you perceive a harm in our Western society, that will cause you to become not just angry, but morally angry. And morally angry because it's a violation of autonomy. Moral disgust is caused by a violation of divinity. And then finally, moral contempt is caused by a violation of community. So the idea here is you're taking the basic emotions and you're recalibrating them into moral emotions by making them sensitive to different norms that you have in your society, and different societies might emphasize different norms. Now these are called the other blame emotions. They're all, when you complain about someone else doing something, you might feel, moral disgust or moral anger or moral contempt. But there's also self-blame emotions. And in that group, he has guilt, which is basically the opposite of anger. What he wants to say is you feel guilty when you violate one of the norms of autonomy. And what guilt is, it's really just a recalibration of sadness. You feel a certain type of sadness, and that's guilt. Shame is the opposite of disgust. And that's the extension of embarrassment, which is a more basic emotion. And then we don't really have a word for the blend of the opposite of anger and disgust that you feel when there's some sort of community violation. All right, so that's the basis for his theory for moral emotions. They're recalibrated basic emotions. And then he wants to claim, here's this definition. This claim will be super important to us later on because this is the foundation of everything else he says. But Jesse Prinz wants to argue that an action has a property of being morally wrong, just in case there is an observer who has a sentiment of disapprobation toward it. So if you have the moral emotion that something is wrong, if there's an observer that has the emotion that it's wrong, then that is the very definition of what makes something morally wrong. Now, you should pause here for a moment. Two things to notice about this claim. First, it's very firmly based on emotional reaction, right? It's all about having a certain gut feeling in response to a norm. That's what makes it morally wrong. But the other part of this is, notice it's very dependent on an observer. It's part of the definition. So if different observers differ in their emotional reactions to things that people do, then they will have different moral attitudes about what the person does. And while it could be true that everyone in the world just happens to share the same moral reactions to things, we know that that's probably not true. People have different, moral emotions in response to different things, like a teenager eating before their elders do it at a dinner table. Some people might get very morally upset about that, and other people not so much. So his definition of morality opens him up immediately to relativism, right? Moral relativism, because it's very, very clearly dependent on the observer. Different observers will have different moral reactions. Jesse Prinz is fully aware of that, and he's fully willing to embrace that. He's a moral relativist. He's happy to embrace relativism and say that different cultures have different moral values, and we're not in a position to judge which set of moral values are better than another set of moral values. So I want to explore that a little bit. Consider cannibalism. So cannibalism, anthropologists claim, is really the default behavior in pre-state societies. A lot of it. 34% of societies studied engage in some form of cannibalism. Very popular thing to do. Now, most of us in the room would feel some degree of moral disgust over the idea of cannibalism. We just don't think it's the right thing to do. Some of us. Yeah. At least 2/3. Okay. So what do we want to say about cannibalism? Because that's obviously, a cultural practice that used to not be accepted, that used to be accepted, that's not accepted now. So what Jesse Prinz wants to do is he first wants to distinguish between something he calls descriptive relativism and meta-ethical relativism. So let me just explain what descriptive relativism is. Descriptive relativism is just the statement that different cultures have different moral values, and they would differ in moral values even if all the moral facts were in. So he takes this just to be a factual claim. Descriptive relativism is just, hey, societies differ in the morality they have, and just as a matter of fact, we know that that's true. So that's descriptive relativism. Now, meta-ethical relativism is the belief that the truth conditions of a moral judgment depend on the context in which that judgment is formed. And the idea here is meta-ethical relativism is a much stronger statement than just pure descriptive relativism, because it's actually the statement that whether a proposition that something is moral is true or false depends on the context in which it's spoken. So it's a much stronger claim. So take, for example, the claim, let's say that there was one society that believed the earth was round, there was another society that believed the earth was flat. So descriptively, they just have different beliefs, but that doesn't change our belief that one group is wrong, one group is right. Hey, guess what? The world is round, those guys are just wrong. But he wants to say something much stronger. He wants to say it's not only that there's a disagreement over the facts, and there's some true fact, underlying all this. He wants to say, no, there's no privileged perspective where we can say that the earth is flat or the earth is round. When you're talking about morality, that there's no privileged point of view, there's no privileged observer. Okay, so he wants to defend meta-ethical relativism based off of his emotional theory of morality. Given the definition of what he considers a moral act, the one I just gave before, says it falls out of that directly, that all morality is your emotional reaction to these norms. And since people can have different emotional reactions, that just shows that relativism must be true. So in particular, if a missionary says that cannibalism is wrong, the missionary is making a judgment relative to the missionary's values. The relativism of the moral judgment is implicit. In our culture, our moral disgust has been recalibrated to cannibalism, but not in the culture of the cannibals. So we just have different moral attitudes about the same act, and neither one of them is privileged. He says, I don't think there's a transcendental stance from which we can assess competing moral theories. There is no view from nowhere. We must always assess progress from the inside. In this respect, morality is not different from science. In Otto Neurath's familiar trope popularized by Quine, theory revision is like rebuilding a raft while we're afloat at sea. We cannot simply abandon our current raft and start anew. We must replace the planks on the raft we already have. This is equally true in the evaluative domain. We cannot simply abandon our current values. The racists cannot imagine loving the members of the reviled race any more than we can imagine reveling in torture. We must retool our values from within. Central metaphor there, we're on this ship. If we want to change our moral values, if there's no transcendental perspective where we can get away from the ship and judge what's wrong with the ship, we have to rebuild that raft plank by plank while we're still, floating around on the ship. He thinks this is a good thing, and this is why. He thinks relativism promotes tolerance, that relativism leads to tolerance. If our values are not privileged, then we should allow others to live in accordance with different values. When a secular community allows an Amish community to continue to live in traditional ways, the member of the secular community are showing tolerance. The Amish are showing tolerance for secularism by not imposing their values on others. This seems like a pretty good thing. That's what he says. Seems like a pretty good thing. Okay, so just to recap, his theory of emotions leads him to a theory of moral emotions. His theory of moral emotions leads him to relativism, and relativism, he states, is a pretty good thing. Okay, so I don't like relativism, and let me explain why. So this is the part, that I was going to disagree with. I'm going to start talking about why I disagree with it. For two main reasons. Reason number one, I do believe humans can make moral progress. I believe in moral progress. We talked about an earlier sermon, Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he talks about there's been quite a bit of moral progress over the last, millennia or so. There's less wars, there's less torture, there's less superstition. People just, in general, lead happier lives, and I believe that that counts as moral progress. That's a good thing. In particular, I believe racism is bad. Yes, I'll embrace that controversial statement. I'll say racism is a bad thing, and I think it's just as true that racism is a bad thing when stated by someone in Virginia in 1861 as it is when someone says it today. And I think that we can say that we've made moral progress in a lot of different areas. So the second reason that I don't like relativism is I believe that you can make moral judgments about the practices in other societies. And in fact, we had another sermon where we talked about the Edgerton book on 6 societies. Remember the Tasmanians? I love those Tasmanians. They traded all of their women for dogs so that they can spend more time hunting. That was just a stupid choice. It was a bad choice, a morally questionable choice. But there's all sorts of examples of really, really dumb things that other cultures do that I just want to say that's morally wrong. Racism in other countries, female circumcision, I can go on and on, but there are a lot of practices that we do in fact make moral judgments about, and I think that we can make these moral judgments. So, Jesse Prinz would argue that there's no transcendental stance to judge different cultures. It's just different cultures have calibrated moral anger, moral disgust, and moral contempt in different ways. There is no standard meter stick that you can use to compare across times and across locations. All right, so the obvious way out of this, if you don't like moral relativism, is to subscribe in a competing theory called evolutionary ethics. And the idea behind evolutionary ethics is, yes, we have moral emotions, yes, and yes, they've been selected by natural selection, and that the natural moral emotions we have are part of human nature, and that these moral emotions do exist across time and across location. Yes, Mickey?
Lions have evolved to kill the cubs of other lions when they take over a pride.
Yes.
Clearly that is not a moral behavior by most people's lights.
Yes.
But there's no prima facie reason to believe that what is what should be.
Yes.
Intelligent, sentient lions might well elect not to kill the cubs of their rival.
Yes.
And the argument, but we evolved that way, would be specious. humans clearly evolved to have a certain rate of sociopathy and a
Yes.
certain rate of rape.
Yes.
That doesn't make being a sociopath or raping someone ethical.
Well, I will address that momentarily. Be patient. We'll get there. Yes, those are good things to bring up. All right. So, but let me lay out the theory first, and then I'll try to defend it. Okay. So, basic theory: humans all have the same basic moral emotions. For example, I'm just going to point to some concrete things that we've talked about before. I think humans have an innate sense of justice. They feel moral anger over injustice. We've talked about the economic experiments, like the ultimatum game, the dictator game, that show that people do have an innate sense of fairness. We've also talked about those monkeys, the monkeys and the cucumbers and the grapes. So, if you give a monkey a cucumber for doing the same job as you would give a grape to, then the monkey gets angry. Not just, not through careful reflection do they decide, hey, this isn't fair. They get angry and they throw the cucumber back at the experimenter again. So I think these things are, just built in. I think they're selected through natural selection. So that's the level. Or, another example, sympathy, to get back to Hume. Hume famously wrote, "Would any man who is walking along tread as willingly on another's gouty toes, whom he has no quarrel with, as on the hard flint and pavement?" So that's a famous quote from David Hume. And his basic idea here is, all things being equal, if you're walking down the road, would you stomp on someone's toes where he has gouty toes? And you wouldn't. Most people just innately have an aversion to causing pain in others. It's just part of our nature. Now, that's not to say it can't be overridden by other concerns, but all things being equal, you're not going to go stomping on other people's gouty toes. Okay, so the issue here is really the nature of human nature, right? From Jesse Prinz's perspective, human nature is determined by culture. From the perspective of someone who wants to defend evolutionary ethics, human nature is determined by biology. And to a certain degree, everyone agrees there's a certain amount of mix in between the two, but we're talking about the extreme positions here. So I'm going to stick to the simplification right now, that there's a biological perspective of moral emotions and there's a cultural perspective. All right, so what are Jesse Prinz's arguments against evolutionary ethics? So let me address those. So what Jesse Prinz writes is Darwinian realism, that's what he's calling evolutionary ethics, conflates two kinds of goods. It tries to reduce moral goodness to biological goodness, but to do so is to change the topic. So he thinks it conflates fitness, which is the main thing that you're concerned about. You're concerned about natural selection, improving differential reproductive success, fitness, with the morally good. So the fit isn't necessarily the good. So by this criteria, if you really did conflate fitness and the morally good, the greatest saint who ever lived would be Genghis Khan. And the reason Genghis Khan would be the greatest saint who ever lived is Genghis Khan is responsible for approximately 16 million people alive today. He's responsible for approximately 5% of the world's male population. He is a saint. It's amazing. But we shouldn't conclude from that Genghis Khan was a good person, right? He maxed out fitness, but he didn't max out morality. And I completely agree, obviously. Genghis Khan is not a saint. We shouldn't be, putting up posters to Genghis Khan. But I think what's happening here is Jesse Prinz is missing the point. Now let me explain why. So let's just focus for a moment on the sense of fairness, on the innate sense that we have. We feel moral anger when we sense injustice. I want to claim that that's just an innate thing. That's biologically determined. There's many possible explanations for that. I think a good explanation for why we have an innate sense of fairness is natural selection, right? There's probably some story, I don't know exactly what the story is, having to do with maybe group selection or kin selection, whatever. There's some sort of story through natural selection to explain why we have the sense of fairness that we do and why chimpanzees and bonobos and monkeys also share this sense with us. But that's not necessarily true. It's possible that it was also caused by random mutation, genetic drift, right? That we just happened through genetic mutation to have the particular set of genes that made us care about fairness. So there wasn't any direct selection, had no effect on fitness at all. It was just, happenstance that we happen to have those genes. Or, and I think that this is especially implausible, or maybe thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, sneaky Martians came to the Earth. They did a little genetic engineering and they changed humans to have a sense of fairness. They just did that, you know, because they want, I don't know, someday humans to be fair creatures. Now, I don't think that happened, but my point is it doesn't really matter which of these stories are true. The point isn't that we have the moral census we have because of natural selection. The point is that these are the ones that we were built with, that we have now, that as humans, it is part of our human nature. These things can be contingent and arbitrary, and it doesn't matter, it doesn't change the fact that these are the moral emotions that we have. I'll get to you in 1 more second, so I want to bring in one more thing.
I'm sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
But at 1 o'clock we're having our discussion across the hall.
Oh, great.
And I know your talk is about 45 minutes, so I want you to have a chance to get through it, and then everyone will take their chair across the hall and we'll have a discussion.
Oh, fantastic.
There.
Nice. Thanks for doing that.
Go ahead.
All right, so quick thought experiment. Ice cream robot. Let me explain what ice cream robot is. So imagine that you decide you're going to build a robot. But for some reason, you decide that the robot will just have one thing it's always after. It just has one preference, it's for ice cream. That's all it does all day. It looks for ice cream, wants to eat ice cream. So in any situation where it has to make a choice, it will choose the path that will lead to more ice cream. Super simple robot. So let's say that you decide to come up to the robot one day and you say, hey, I need to ask you some questions about, you know, why you care so much about eating ice cream. And you know what ice cream robot would respond? Don't bother me, I'm eating ice cream. That's the way we would respond. But once you offer him some ice cream, he might, you know, divulge some of his reasons that he's interested in eating ice cream. He might, he would say, if you really pressed him on why, you know, he wants to eat ice cream, he would just say it's a basic fact about my nature, right? I've never actually thought a lot about it. I've spent all my time, you know, seeking ice cream all day, but I haven't actually given a lot of thought to why I'm built this way, and to a certain degree, I don't care. I am an ice cream robot, and that's what I do. And then, so you might push him on this. You might say, hey, ice cream robot, Cheetos. Very good. Have you ever thought about going after Cheetos instead of ice cream? And the proper response for ice cream robot is to say, no, I have zero preference. I was built with this interest in ice cream. Trying to get me to switch my preferences over to Cheetos is just crazy. I have no reason to change my basic, you know, motivations. So I really want to say the same thing about the particular preferences, emotions, and motivations, drives, whatever word you want to use, that are built into humans. We have the particular set of preferences and drives that we were built with. However we got here doesn't really matter, but these are the things that drive us to make the decisions that we make. And this is, you know, really the point from David Hume, that reason is a slave of the passions. You can't derive, you know, ought from is, that human nature is the way that human nature is. I believe that human nature and human morality is contingent and therefore to a certain degree arbitrary. Nature gave us the fundamental preferences we have. In particular, all things being equal, we feel sympathy and we want to make people happy instead of sad. We have an innate sense of justice. We feel moral anger when we perceive a situation as unjust. But that's not to say that we couldn't have been different. You can imagine a society of Martians where they didn't have those preferences. They don't care about helping other people. They don't get upset about unfairness. And in that case, I would say there'd be no convincing the Martians. They do not share our morality. There's no way to convince a Martian to start eating Cheetos if a Martian's interested in ice cream. That's just it's a brute fact about Martian psychology. Okay, so Jesse Prinz would push back on this and say that there's no reason to think that biology is privileged over culture. Why emphasize biological drives over cultural drives? Why, you know, emphasize what's innate over what's learned? There's two reasons, I think, to do this. First, I don't think you can teach fundamental motivations. And that goes back to Hume's point again. The only motivation for accepting cultural moral values would be biological. You can adopt new cultural values, but only within the context of the fundamental motivations that you're born with. So anything that you're going to learn, and I think that fundamental moral values can be elaborated in different ways in different cultures, and that there's different equally valid ways to be able to show concern and sympathy and be able to be concerned about justice, that all this can be culturally determined, but I think the basic sense of justice and the basic sense of sympathy is something that we share with all humans, even if it's elaborated in different ways across different cultures. So that's one reason. Second reason is biology supplies us with a standard meter stick. We're back to a way, I agree that there's no transcendental sense of morality if you go above, if you compare, for example, humans and Martians. You can't say that humans are right versus Martians if they have fundamentally different biology. But I do want to say that across cultures and across time, that you can appeal to the same standard set of moral emotions and be able to make comparisons. So let's go back to the example of cannibalism. So I'm going to offer you a personal story. So I used to, as I mentioned before, I used to live in Borneo. I lived with a family of Dayaks for a while. Dayaks are famous in Borneo for cannibalism. Until about 50 years ago, they engaged in cannibalism. And I had conversations about cannibalism with my family when I lived in Borneo. And I remember one conversation with my host mother at the time. And her reaction was, you know, she was insulted on the question of cannibalism because she said, well, we never ate, you know, human flesh for food. It wasn't for the nutritional value. It was after we defeated our enemies, we wanted to eat their hearts to gain their power. So next time we went to war, we could defeat them. And so that seemed obvious, right? I mean, you know, that's disgusting. Eating people for food, that's crazy talk. Eating people to steal their power, that makes complete sense. So what I want to say in that case is, there is not, I think that what we have, and I have abundant evidence because I lived with these people for a long time, there's not a lot of variation across cultures and basic moral values. The variation comes from differences in factual beliefs about the world. I think if we did a controlled experiment with a set of Dayaks and showed that after defeating your enemies, it didn't make any difference at all whether you ate their hearts, you would still be just as good in battle or just as bad, Dayaks would give up the practice of eating the hearts of their enemies after they defeated them in battle because they would be convinced that it doesn't do what they think it would do. And I actually believe that a lot of moral disputes are factual disputes. They're not disputes about fundamental, you know, things about human nature. Okay, so in short, you can convince cannibals not to eat humans. And it's wrong. Please stop eating humans. It's a bad thing to do. And I'll make that judgment right here from Western society. So let me conclude this sermon by saying that I agree with Jesse Prinz that the right way to understand the foundation of human morality is by taking a look at the moral emotions. I think the fundamental things that drive us to be good or bad are the moral emotions that we have. But unlike Prinz, I don't think that moral emotions are culturally determined. I think they're biologically determined. They're things that we share across history and across cultures. It's just a fact about human nature. And then finally, for this reason, I reject Jesse Prinz's arguments for relativism. Unlike Jesse Prinz, I believe that cannibalism is morally wrong, Hitler was a bad guy, and racism is wrong no matter what century you live in. And so let's stop here, and I think you said we have place for a discussion.
Yes,
Yep.
so we're going to discuss across the hall, so if everybody would just take their chair and go over there and you grab these two things, I'll clean up the snack.